Garrick Thane had been dead for 20 years by the time anyone bothered asking whether the body they'd buried actually belonged to him. And for 19 of those years, he'd lived quietly enough on the mining world of Korast's Hollow that the question never had any reason to reach him. He worked the surface refineries under a name that wasn't his own, kept to a small rented room above a supply depot that smelled permanently of processed ore dust, and had trained himself, over 2 decades, to stop flinching every time someone addressed him by that false name, though the training had never fully taken. Some small, stubborn part of him still expecting, even after all this time, to hear his actual name called across a crowded room. Korast's Hollow was not, by any reasonable measure, a place a man chose to live for its own merits. The world's thin, mineral-heavy atmosphere required filtration masks for anyone working the surface refineries, longer than a few hours at a stretch. Its perpetual twilight sky, the color of old bruises, from the particulate haze that never fully settled, and its population, drawn mostly from people running from something rather than toward anything, tended to ask few questions of newcomers and expect even fewer answers in return. Garrick had chosen it, or rather Ven's network had chosen it for him, precisely because it was the kind of place where a quiet, unremarkable man with a slight limp and a habit of, watching exits a little too carefully could disappear. Into the general background, noise of everyone else's own carefully unexamined pasts. The attack that ended his old life happened on a bright, ceremonial morning that the Calyx Dominion's official history still commemorated every year. The 12th birthday celebration of Princess Merit Callow, heir to the Dominion's sovereign seat, held in the palace's grand processional courtyard before a crowd of several thousand citizens who had gathered to watch a child wave from a balcony because that was, in those years, still considered a sufficient reason for celebration. Garrick had been a junior member of the Palace Guard that morning. 23 years old, and barely 2 years into a posting he'd taken more out of practical necessity than any grand ambition, standing at a position along the courtyard's eastern colonnade that his training officer had assured him was purely ceremonial. The kind of assignment given to guards not yet trusted with anything more consequential. He remembered, even 20 years later, the specific texture of that morning with a clarity that never dulled the way most memory eventually does. The particular gold quality of the light falling across the courtyard's white stone, the smell of the flowering vines the palace gardeners had trained along the colonnade's upper arches for the occasion, the low, pleasant murmur of a crowd that had no reason yet to expect anything but a pleasant, uneventful ceremony. He remembered thinking, in the idle way a bored young guard thinks about nothing in particular, that he'd need to write his mother back on Earth about the flowering vines specifically, because she'd always loved gardens and would want to hear the small, unremarkable details he usually forgot to include in his letters home. The strike came from beneath the colonnade itself, a detonation device concealed in the courtyard's ornamental stonework weeks earlier, by hands nobody would successfully trace for another 20 years. Timed to detonate at the precise moment Princess Marae's procession crossed directly beneath it. Garrick was close enough to hear the device's arming sequence in the half-second before it triggered. A faint, mechanical click his training had taught him to recognize without ever expecting to actually need that recognition. And he moved before conscious thought caught up with instinct, closing the distance to the 12-year-old princess and driving both of them clear of the colonnade's collapse zone in the same motion that put his own body between her and the worst of the blast. He remembered very little of what happened. Immediately afterward, fragments only. The specific white-hot pressure of the explosion's edge catching his lower back and legs. The sound of the crowd's screaming arriving strangely delayed, as if his ears had briefly stopped working properly. And Princess Merit's face, wide-eyed and uncomprehending beneath him, asking him something he never fully made out before the world went dark around the edges, and then entirely black. What he learned only much later, pieced together across 19 years of careful, dangerous inquiry conducted from a mining world. Nobody expected him to still be capable of thinking clearly enough to conduct anything from, was that he had not in fact died in that courtyard, though the Dominion's official record insisted permanently and completely that he had. Regent Osgar Venn served in those years as chief minister to Princess Merit's father, a role that placed him closer to the actual machinery of Dominion governance than the sovereign himself, who preferred the ceremonial weight of his position to its exhausting daily administration, and had, over years of quiet delegation, allowed Ven to accumulate an authority the formal structure of the Dominion never officially recognized, but everyone who worked inside the palace understood perfectly well. Ven had built that accumulated authority patiently, over nearly 15 years of service, positioning loyal appointees throughout the palace's administrative apparatus, with the same careful, incremental patience a spider might bring to building a web. Nobody noticed until they were already caught in it. And by the time of Meret's 12th birthday celebration, there was scarcely a department within the Dominion's governance that didn't answer, in some quiet, unofficial capacity, to him, rather than to the sovereign whose name still technically commanded it. Ven had commissioned the colonnade device himself, working through intermediaries careful enough that the investigation which followed the attack never traced the device's origin any further than a dead-end contractor who conveniently died in a shipyard accident before he could be formally questioned. He had planned the attack's timing meticulously, choosing the birthday ceremony specifically because its predictable, ceremonial nature made security considerably more relaxed than it would be during any of the Dominion's more politically sensitive gatherings, and he had built into every layer of the plan enough deniability that even a thorough investigation would find nothing conclusive enough to trace back toward the palace's own chief minister. Ven's motive, as Garrick eventually understood it, was neither complicated nor original. A calculated bet that removing the sovereign's only heir during a period of political instability would leave the succession question open long enough for Ven's own faction to maneuver a considerably more pliable candidate into position, a plan that failed only because a junior guard nobody had bothered training for anything. Consequential happened to be standing exactly where he needed to be. Garrick's survival, when medical teams pulled him from the colonnade's wreckage still breathing, presented Ven with a problem his original plan had never accounted for. A dead hero was useful, a martyr whose sacrifice could be commemorated publicly, while the actual investigation into the attack quietly stalled and eventually closed for lack of leads. A living witness, one who had been close enough to the device's detonation to potentially recall details about its placement or timing that might eventually point back toward whoever had commissioned it, was considerably more dangerous, and Ven, working with a physician he'd cultivated years earlier, through a combination of debt and quiet blackmail, made a decision in the chaotic hours following the attack that would define the next 20 years of Garrick's life. The physician, a man named Corlin Ibset, who Garrick would not learn the full name of for nearly 15 years, had been treating a private, considerably compromising condition for a member of Ven's own household for years prior. A debt of silence Ven now called in without hesitation the moment Garrick's survival became known to him. Ibset falsified Garrick's medical records to indicate he had died from his injuries during emergency surgery, a fabrication constructed with enough clinical detail to survive routine review. Arranged for a body considerably too damaged for casual identification to be substituted in his place, sourced quietly from the same shadow network Ven had used to acquire the colonnade device itself, and quietly transferred the still unconscious, critically wounded Garrick to a private medical facility Ven controlled through a shell arrangement, several layers removed from his own name. Garrick woke, nearly 3 weeks later, in a sparse medical room with no windows, attended by staff who addressed him only by a numbered designation, and answered none of his questions about where he was or how long he'd been there. His first coherent memory of consciousness was the specific, disorienting confusion of pain medication, wearing thin enough to let him think clearly, without yet letting him think clearly enough to understand what he was looking at. A plain white ceiling, a single monitoring device humming quietly beside his bed, and an attendant who checked his vitals with brisk efficiency and left without answering a single one of the questions he tried, in a voice barely above a whisper, to ask. It took him nearly 4 days of increasingly frustrated, increasingly frightened attempts before a guard stationed outside his room considerably less disciplined than his colleagues about maintaining the facility's careful silence, finally answered him honestly, rather than simply repeating the standard non-answer Garrick had grown to expect. The guard, a younger man who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with whatever role he'd been assigned in Garrick's confinement, told him in a low, hurried voice during a moment when the corridor outside stood empty, that the official Dominion record had already declared him dead, that a state funeral had already been held in his honor, that a memorial statue was already being commissioned for the courtyard where the attack had taken place, and that his own parents, back on Earth, had already been informed of his death and had already, according to the guard's careless second-hand account, begun the process of grieving a son who was, in fact, lying awake in a locked medical room 3 systems away. Garrick spent the following hours after that revelation in a state he still, 20 years later, struggled to fully describe, a horror that arrived in waves rather than all at once, each new implication surfacing only once the previous one had been at least partially absorbed. His mother, who wrote him letters every week without fail, believing him dead. His father, who had never been particularly demonstrative but who Garrick knew, with the specific certainty of a son who understood his own parent, would have taken the news considerably harder than his careful, reserved manner would ever let show publicly. A funeral held for an empty coffin, or worse, for a coffin containing someone else entirely. Strangers gathered to mourn a version of him that had never actually died. The threat that kept him silent through the following months of forced, isolated recovery was delivered plainly by Venn himself, during the only direct conversation the two men ever had in those early years. A visit Venn made to Garrick's sealed room roughly 2 months into his confinement. Once it became clear the injuries wouldn't kill him, and some more permanent arrangement would need to be reached, Venn arrived without any of the ceremony Garrick might have expected from a man of his position. Simply a well-dressed figure who entered the room, dismissed the attending guard with a brief gesture, and settled into the room's single visitors' chair with the unhurried composure of a man entirely confident in the outcome of whatever conversation was about to follow. Venn didn't bother with elaborate justification. He told Garrick, with the flat, businesslike calm of a man delivering an unpleasant but entirely reasonable proposal, that his continued existence had become a liability that could be managed in one of exactly 2 ways: permanently and violently, or quietly and comfortably, provided Garrick understood that his silence extended not just to himself, but to the safety of a mother and father he would never be permitted to contact again, into the ongoing physical well-being of any Dominion citizen, unlucky enough to share Garrick's face if he ever attempted to publicly reveal himself. He spoke throughout that entire conversation with an unhurried, almost paternal patience, as though he were explaining a regrettable but necessary business decision to a junior colleague, rather than dismantling the entire remaining structure of a young man's life. And Garrick, still weak from injuries he hadn't fully recovered from, found himself unable to muster anything beyond a hollow, disbelieving silence in response. Garrick, 23 years old, badly injured, isolated, and entirely without allies inside a system that had already erased him from its own records, chose the quiet, comfortable option, understanding it for the cage it plainly was, and seeing no realistic path toward anything else. He asked Venn, in the only real defiance he managed during that entire conversation, whether the man felt anything at all about the 12-year-old girl he'd nearly killed. In Venn's answer, delivered without any visible emotion whatsoever, stayed with Garrick for the following 2 decades with a clarity that never faded. The girl, Venn told him, was simply a variable in a larger calculation, unfortunate but not personal, and Garrick would do well going forward to understand his own continued existence in exactly the same clinical, unsentimental terms. He was relocated to Karast's Hollow 8 months after the attack, once his physical recovery had progressed far enough to permit independent living, settled into a modest position at the world's surface refineries through paperwork Venn's network had quietly arranged, provided with a new identity, thorough enough to survive routine scrutiny, and a monthly stipend delivered through channels specifically designed to leave no traceable connection back to the Dominion Palace. He understood within his first year on Korast's Hollow that this arrangement was never going to end through any negotiation available to him. That Ven's threat against his parents remained live and enforceable for as long as Ven retained his position of influence, and that the only realistic path forward was simply surviving inside the cage he'd been given, however quietly. However completely it had swallowed the life he'd once expected to lead. The years that followed blurred together with the specific, grinding sameness of a life deliberately built to attract no attention. Shifts at the refinery, a small rented room, occasional evenings spent at a modest tavern run by a woman named Corvin DeSelle, who had, unbeknownst to her for most of those years, become the only person on Korast's Hollow who genuinely knew him rather than the careful, unremarkable fiction he presented to everyone else. Corvine's tavern sat at the edge of the refinery district, a low, sturdy building she'd inherited from her own father and had run for the better part of 2 decades, with the same weathered, unhurried competence she brought to everything else in her life. A woman who had buried a husband to a mining accident years before Garrick's arrival and had built, in the years since, a quiet, self-sufficient existence that asked little of the world and expected even less in return. Garrick found himself drawn to her tavern in his first months on the world less for the drink than for the specific, undemanding quality of her presence, a woman who noticed a new, unusually watchful patron without pressing him for the kind of personal history most newcomers on Korast's Hollow eventually volunteered simply to fill the silence. She served him his first meal on the world without asking a single question beyond what he wanted to drink. And something in that restraint, small as it was, had struck him, in his still raw grief and disorientation, as the closest thing to kindness he'd encountered since waking in that sealed medical room. Corvine had nursed him through a severe refinery injury during his 3rd year on the world, an accident that reopened old wounds from the colonnade attack badly enough that he'd spent nearly 2 weeks in her care, than risk the world's official medical facility asking questions his falsified records couldn't fully answer. The accident itself happened during a routine maintenance shift, a support strut giving way beneath a load he'd been positioned under, and the resulting fall reopened the deep tissue damage along his lower back that the original blast had caused. Damage his falsified medical history described in terms vague enough that any thorough examination risked exposing the fiction his entire life on Korast's Hollow depended on. He'd made his way to Corvine's tavern, rather than the refinery's medical station, on instinct alone, barely conscious from the pain, and she'd taken him in without hesitation, tending his injuries with a rough practical competence she'd apparently picked up, nursing her own husband through a string of mining injuries during their marriage, and asking throughout those 2 weeks of care only the questions that mattered for treating him properly, rather than the ones that would have exposed exactly how far his cover story diverged from reality. Somewhere across those 2 weeks of quiet, patient nursing, he had told her more of the truth than he'd told anyone else in the 11 years since the attack. Not everything, not enough to genuinely endanger her, but enough that she understood from that point forward that the quiet, unremarkable man drinking alone in her tavern most evenings carried a weight considerably heavier than anyone else on Korast's Hollow would ever guess. He remembered the specific night he'd told her the fragment he did share, feverish and disoriented enough that he later worried he'd said considerably more than he intended, describing a courtyard and an explosion, and a name that wasn't the one he currently used. And Corvine, rather than pressing him for the full story his fevered account clearly implied, had simply sat with him through the worst of that night, changing dressings and offering water, and had never once in all the years that followed asked him to explain more than he'd chosen to share on his own. Corvine never pushed him for more than he offered, and Garrick came to depend on her steady, undemanding presence in a way he rarely examined too closely, understanding, somewhere beneath the surface of his own careful self-discipline, that she had become the closest thing to genuine connection his stolen life had left available to him. Their relationship developed slowly across the following years, evenings at her tavern becoming a fixture of his routine rather than an occasional indulgence. Conversations that started as the comfortable, Low-stakes talk of two people passing time and gradually deepened into something considerably more substantial. Corvine sharing pieces of her own history, her late husband, a daughter who'd left the world years earlier for a better life elsewhere and rarely wrote. The particular loneliness of running a business built around other people's company, without much of her own. Garrick found himself, across those years, offering her considerably more of his genuine self than he offered anyone else on Korast's Hollow. Careful still about the specific details that might endanger either of them, but honest in every way that actually mattered, and he came to understand, somewhere in his 9th or 10th year on the world, that whatever this relationship had become, it had grown into something he genuinely didn't want to lose, a realization that frightened him nearly as much as it comforted him. Given how thoroughly Ven's threat still hung over any life he might try to build, she was the one who first brought him news. In his 14th year on the world of his parents' deaths, information she'd found through a careful, roundabout inquiry she'd made on his behalf without ever fully telling him she was making it, sparing him the specific mechanics of how she'd learned it, and simply delivering the fact itself with a gentleness that didn't make the news land any less like a physical blow. She'd noticed across the preceding months a growing restlessness in him, a specific kind of longing he never fully articulated, but that she'd learned, over a decade of careful attention, to recognize anyway, and she'd quietly begun making inquiries through a distant cousin who worked in a records office with access to public colonial registries. Careful, deniable inquiries that eventually surfaced the information she'd hoped, against her own better judgment, might actually be good news rather than the confirmation of exactly what she'd feared. His mother had died of an illness the Dominion's public health records described only briefly. His father less than a year later, of what Corvine's contact described only as a broken kind of grief that outlived any specific diagnosis. And Garrick understood, receiving that news in the quiet back room of Corvine's tavern, that whatever remained of his old life had now finished dying entirely. That even if he somehow found his way free of Ven's threat, there would be no parents left to return to. No family waiting to understand why their son had spent 14 years silently allowing them to believe him dead. He wept that night in a way he hadn't allowed himself to weep since waking in that sealed medical room 14 years earlier, and Corvine sat with him through the worst of it without offering any of the hollow, well-meaning platitudes he'd have found unbearable in that moment. Simply present, simply steady, the same quality that had drawn him to her tavern in the first place, now carrying him through the worst grief he'd experienced since the attack itself. He began, in the years following his parents' deaths, a slow, careful project he'd never fully admitted to himself was actually an investigation, using the refinery's outdated but functional communication terminals during off hours to piece together fragments of information about the attack, about Ven's rise to increasingly consolidated authority within the Dominion Palace, about the broader political landscape his own erasure had helped, in some small, invisible way, to shape. He was careful, methodical, patient in exactly the way his old militia training had once taught him to be patient, understanding that any misstep in this quiet inquiry risked confirming to Ven's network that the arrangement's silence had finally cracked, and he built, across nearly 5 more years of careful, incremental work, a private understanding of exactly how thoroughly Ven had consolidated power in the 2 decades since the Colonnade attack, and exactly how precarious Princess Mirette's own position had become as her coronation, delayed repeatedly by Ven's careful political maneuvering, finally approached. Princess Marit Callow had grown, across those same 20 years, into a woman whose public reputation bore little resemblance to the frightened 12-year-old Garrick, remembered pulling clear of a collapsing colonnade, a careful, deliberate political operator who had spent her adult years quietly building alliances across the Dominion's fractured noble houses, specifically to counterbalance Ven's own entrenched influence. Aware, in the vague, unspecific way anyone raised inside a palace eventually becomes aware, that her father's chief minister held considerably more power than his official title should have permitted, and considerably less loyalty to her own succession than his public deference suggested. Her own childhood, following the attack had been shaped, in ways she only fully understood as an adult, by a careful, deliberate campaign of misdirection she'd never had reason to question at the time. A father who discouraged her from asking too many questions about the investigation's stalled progress. A chief minister who managed every aspect of the memorial arrangements with a thoroughness that, in retrospect, seemed considerably more concerned with closing the matter quickly than with genuinely honoring the guard who'd saved her life. She'd grown up beneath a statue of a man she barely remembered clearly, attending an annual memorial ceremony that Ven's own office organized down to the smallest detail, and had absorbed without ever consciously deciding to, a version of the attack's aftermath that served Ven's interests considerably more than it served the truth. She began, roughly 2 years before her scheduled coronation, a quiet review of the palace's security archives, ostensibly to prepare updated protocols for the coronation ceremony itself. And it was during that review, conducted by a small team of investigators she trusted specifically because they owed their positions to her own patronage rather than Ven's, that the first genuine cracks in the colonnade attack's official record began to surface. The review had started in its earliest weeks as exactly the kind of routine bureaucratic exercise its official purpose suggested, cross-referencing decades-old security logs against current protocols to identify outdated procedures worth updating before the coronation's own heightened security demands. It was Dessa Kern who first noticed, buried in a routine cross-reference of archived personnel records, a discrepancy that seemed on its surface too minor to warrant much attention. A gap of nearly 6 hours between the colonnade attack's official time of occurrence and the timestamp on Garrick Thane's medical examiner's report. Dessa pulled the thread carefully, over the following weeks cross-referencing that initial discrepancy against every other document connected to the attack's aftermath she could access through her own legitimate clearance, and found, piece by piece, a pattern considerably more troubling than a single administrative error could explain. The inconsistencies were small individually, and considerable once assembled together. A medical examiner's report on Garrick Thane's death that had been filed nearly 6 hours after the official time of death it recorded. A burial record for his memorial plot that listed no formal identification confirmation. A state funeral organized and executed with a speed that, in retrospect, seemed considerably faster than protocol for a hero's memorial typically allowed, as though someone with authority to expedite the process had specifically wanted the matter closed before anyone thought to ask more careful questions. She found, too, a curious gap in the original investigation's own records. Interview transcripts with several palace staff members who'd been present during the attack's aftermath that appeared to have been quietly removed from the official file at some point, after the investigation formally closed, a removal that left no clear record of who had authorized it or why. Merritt's lead investigator, a sharp, unassuming woman named Dessa Kern, who had served the princess loyally since Merritt's own adolescence, brought these inconsistencies to her privately, framing them not as proof of anything specific, but as a pattern that deserved considerably more scrutiny than the original investigation had apparently received. Merritt remembers that conversation with a specific, uncomfortable clarity, sitting across from Dessa in a private study late one evening, listening to her carefully laid out findings and feeling something she hadn't expected to feel at the prospect of learning her old guard's death might not have been entirely what she'd been told. A cold, creeping dread rather than the simple curiosity she might have anticipated, as though some part of her had always sensed, without ever fully articulating it, that the official story didn't quite fit the fragmentary memories she still carried from that morning. Merritt's own memory of the attack itself remained fragmentary, the specific, disorienting kind of memory a traumatized 12-year-old retains from the worst morning of her life. But one detail had stayed with her clearly across 20 years. The weight and warmth of the young guard's body covering hers in the seconds before the blast, and a single word he'd said to her, muffled and urgent, that she'd never been entirely certain she'd heard correctly, and had never found anyone willing to help her verify. She had in fact asked her father directly about it once, years earlier in her late teens, only to watch him deflect the question with a gentle but firm insistence that dwelling on the attack's details would only prolong grief that both of them deserved to finally set down. Response that had at the time seemed like reasonable parental concern, and now, viewed through the lens of Dessa's findings, felt considerably more like the kind of careful redirection Ven's own influence had likely shaped long before it ever reached her father's mouth. She began, once Dessa's findings gave her sufficient reason, a careful, private inquiry into exactly what had happened to Garrick Thane's body in the hours following the attack. An inquiry conducted with the specific caution of someone who had grown up inside a palace and understood, better than most, exactly how dangerous it could be to investigate a powerful man's secrets, while that man still held considerable sway over the very institutions meant to enforce accountability against him. She limited the investigation's scope deliberately, keeping it confined to Dessa and a small handful of investigators whose loyalty she trusted absolutely, understanding that any premature leak of what they were uncovering risked alerting whoever was responsible before the investigation had assembled enough evidence to matter, a caution that would prove in the following months considerably more prescient than she initially realized. Garrick learned, through his own careful network of Corust's Hollow contacts and the occasional smuggled fragment of Dominion news that reached even this remote mining world, that Ven's political position had begun, in the months leading up to Moret's coronation, to show genuine strain for the first time in 2 decades, the princess's careful alliance-building finally assembling enough support among the Dominion's noble houses to threaten Ven's continued influence once she formally assumed the sovereign seat. He understood, piecing together this information with the same patient, methodical attention he'd once brought to reading a besieged terrain, that a man like Ven, cornered and facing the genuine loss of everything he'd spent 20 years consolidating, was unlikely to simply accept that loss gracefully, and the specific, cold dread that settled over him, reading those fragments, felt uncomfortably, unmistakably familiar. The confirmation came through a contact he'd cultivated carefully over several years, a disillusioned former member of Ven's own household staff who had relocated to Corust's Hollow after a falling out with the Regent's administration, and who, over several careful, deniable conversations in Corvine's tavern, revealed to Garrick a fragment of information that confirmed his worst suspicion. Vin was orchestrating a second attack, timed for Moret's coronation ceremony itself, structured to appear as an act of factional violence from a rival noble house rather than anything traceable back to his own hand. The same essential strategy he'd employed 20 years earlier, refined now by 2 additional decades of practiced concealment. Garrick spent 3 sleepless nights after receiving that confirmation, working through a decision he'd spent 20 years avoiding having to make. He understood, with a clarity that made the choice considerably harder rather than easier, that revealing himself now, breaking the silence Ven had enforced through threats against parents who could no longer be threatened because they were already gone, would end whatever remained of the quiet, unremarkable life he'd built on Corust's Hollow, would expose Corvine and everyone else who'd known him here to a danger they'd never signed up for, and offered no guarantee whatsoever that a 20-year-old cover-up could be unraveled quickly enough to actually prevent whatever Ven was planning. He walked, during the second of those sleepless nights, out to the refinery's perimeter fence, standing alone in Corust's Hollow's perpetual twilight haze, and turning the decision over and over in his mind with the same methodical, exhausting thoroughness he'd once brought to defending an impossible position, weighing every consequence he could anticipate against a duty he'd never fully stopped feeling, however carefully he'd buried it beneath 20 years of deliberate ordinariness. He thought about his parents, gone now beyond any chance of ever understanding why their son had let them grieve a lie for 14 years. He thought about Corvine and the quiet, hard-won peace they'd built together, a peace he understood standing at that fence he was about to risk entirely. And he thought finally about a 12-year-old girl's face beneath him in a collapsing courtyard, and the specific, uncomplicated certainty he'd felt in that single instant of instinct, a certainty that had cost him everything and that he found. Turning it over one final time, he still couldn't fully regret. He understood, too, that remaining silent now Protecting a life that had already cost him nearly everything that once made it worth protecting would mean allowing a woman he'd once thrown his own body across to face, alone and unwarned, the same danger he'd once absorbed for her without a second thought. That comparison, more than any other consideration, finally settled the decision for him. He had been 23 years old and acting on pure instinct the first time. He was 43 now, with 2 decades to actually weigh the cost, and he found, standing at that fence as the sky finally shifted toward whatever passed for dawn on Korast's Hollow, that the weighing hadn't actually changed the answer at all. He told Corvine everything, the full truth this time, in her tavern's back room on the 3rd sleepless night, watching her absorb 20 years of carefully withheld history, with a stillness that told him she'd suspected, on some level considerably more of it than she'd ever let on. He described the colonnade attack in full detail for the first time in 20 years, Ven's visit to his sealed medical room, Ibset's falsified records, the specific, cold calculation in Ven's voice describing a 12-year-old girl as an unfortunate variable, and Corvine listened through all of it without interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from careful attention to a quiet, contained fury that Garrick hadn't expected and found, somewhat to his own surprise, deeply moving. She didn't try to talk him out of what he was clearly deciding to do. She simply asked him once he'd finished what he needed from her to make it possible, a question that told him, more clearly than any declaration could have, exactly how thoroughly this quiet, unremarkable woman had come to matter to him across 14 years of careful, guarded friendship. She helped him over the following 2 days, arrange the practical details of his departure, drawing on connections she'd built over decades running a tavern in a world full of people quietly moving between places for reasons they didn't discuss, securing him passage on a transport considerably less likely to draw official attention than any route he could have arranged alone. She told him on the morning he finally left that she'd be here when whatever came next was finished, whether that took days or years, a promise she delivered with the same steady, undemanding certainty that had first drawn him to her tavern 14 years earlier. And Garrick carried that promise with him through every uncertain mile of the journey that followed. A small, steady point of certainty in a plan that offered him very little else to hold on to. The journey back to the Dominion capital took considerably longer than Garrick would have liked. 3 transfers across increasingly cramped and increasingly suspicious transport routes, traveling under the same false identity he'd carried for 20 years because his real one, resurrected now for the first time since a state funeral had buried it, carried no travel documentation of any kind, and would have triggered exactly the kind of official attention he needed to avoid until the moment he chose to reveal himself. He arrived in the capital 2 days before Moret's scheduled coronation, exhausted, uncertain, and carrying nothing beyond the disillusioned former staffer's account and his own 20-year-old memory of a courtyard he'd never expected to see again. He didn't go directly to the palace. 20 years of careful survival had taught him better than that, and he understood that walking into a building Ven's network still monitored, with proof considerably thinner than he'd have liked, risked ending everything before he ever got the chance to actually warn anyone. He went instead to Dessa Kern, whose name he'd learned through the same fragile network of contacts that had confirmed Ven's plot in the first place, finding her at a private residence considerably removed from palace grounds and delivering, in a conversation that took most of that first night, an account she initially received with the guarded skepticism of a woman who had spent years learning not to trust convenient revelations that arrived precisely when they were most needed. What ultimately convinced her wasn't any single piece of evidence Garrick offered, but the accumulated granular specificity of his account, details about the colonnade attack's exact timing, about Ibset's falsified medical records, about the particular language Ven had used delivering his original threat, details that matched with an unsettling precision the exact pattern of inconsistencies Dessa's own investigation had already surfaced, without ever fully understanding what they meant. She brought him to Moret directly, the following morning, choosing to bypass every formal channel that might have given Ven's network warning. And Garrick found himself, 20 years after a courtyard explosion he'd never expected to survive, standing in a private palace chamber facing a woman he barely recognized from the frightened 12-year-old he remembered. A woman who studied his face for a long, searching moment before asking him, in a voice considerably steadier than he'd expected given the circumstances, to repeat the exact word he'd said to her in the seconds before the blast. He told her. It was her name, spoken as a warning, the only word he'd managed before instinct took over entirely, and watching that specific private confirmation land. Watching 20 years of uncertain, half-remembered grief finally resolve into something she could actually trust, was the first moment since his arrival in the capital that Garrick allowed himself to believe this might actually work. The coronation proceeded on schedule the following day, though considerably more carefully managed than the Dominion's public ceremony suggested to the assembled crowd. Mirit's own loyal security forces, coordinated quietly by Dessa Kern in the preceding 24 hours, positioned throughout the processional route in configurations that deviated meaningfully from Ven's own official security plan without ever alerting his network to the change. The ceremony's public face proceeded exactly as scheduled. Banners and formal processions, and the same kind of ceremonial pageantry that had once filled the courtyard on the morning of Miret's 12th birthday. And Garrick, watching the crowd assemble from his position along the colonnade, felt the specific disorienting weight of standing in almost the exact place his old life had ended 20 years earlier. The same white stone, the same flowering vines trained along the upper arches, a deliberate detail Miret had apparently insisted on restoring for this ceremony specifically, though she never fully explained to him why until much later. Garrick stood, Miret's specific and deliberate request, in a position along the same eastern colonnade where he'd once nearly died. No longer hidden, no longer anonymous, dressed in a set of formal attire that felt, after 20 years of deliberately unremarkable clothing, almost unbearably conspicuous. He'd argued against the visibility of that position during the planning the night before, uncomfortable with the exposure it represented, and Miret had told him, with a quiet firmness that reminded him, briefly and strangely, of the woman he'd have expected the frightened 12-year-old to become, that she needed him precisely there, in that exact spot because she understood, better than her security advisors did, exactly what symbolic weight that positioning carried for anyone watching who remembered the original attack, whether they consciously understood why or not. Ven's operatives moved on the procession almost exactly as the disillusioned staffer's information had predicted, 3 individuals positioned to appear, in the chaos of any resulting violence, as members of a rival noble house's private guard, timed to strike during the ceremony's most vulnerable formal moment. The exact instant the crown itself would be lowered onto Miret's head. A moment of maximum symbolic and practical vulnerability that Ven had clearly chosen with the same careful, patient calculation he'd once applied to a 12-year-old's birthday celebration. What Ven's plan had never accounted for was a security response that already knew precisely where and when to expect it, and the operatives found themselves intercepted within seconds of revealing their weapons, overwhelmed by a security detail that had spent the previous night rehearsing exactly this scenario rather than discovering it in real time the way Ven's original scheme depended on. Garrick's own role in that final confrontation was smaller than the moment's dramatic weight might suggest. A single operative breaking toward Miret's position during the brief chaos of the initial engagement, intercepted and disarmed by a man 20 years removed from active combat training, but not, it turned out, from the instincts that training had once carved into him permanently. He put the man down with considerably less precision than he might have managed at 23, his own body carrying 2 decades of accumulated wear. The original attack's injuries had never fully allowed to heal properly, the old wound across his lower back flaring with a familiar sharp pain as he moved. But the outcome mattered considerably more than the technique, and Miret Callow stood in the aftermath unharmed, watching the same man who'd once thrown himself across her as a child do it again, imperfectly, and at real cost to himself, as an adult who had every reason left to simply walk away and hadn't. Ven's own unraveling, once the coronation's failed attack made the connection to his authorship impossible to fully suppress, happened with a speed that stood in sharp, bitter contrast to the 20 years his original crime had gone entirely unpunished. Dessa Kern's investigators, working now with formal authority Merritt's freshly secured coronation granted them, traced the attack's operatives back through channels that led, this time, directly to members of Ven's own household staff. Evidence considerably harder to obscure than the original colonnade device had ever needed to be, given that Ven had underestimated badly how much preparation his target's side had managed in the days before his final plan executed. He did not survive his own arrest, choosing, in the final hours before Dominion security reached his private chambers, an ending that denied everyone, Garrick included, the full public accounting his 20 years of accumulated crimes genuinely deserved. I won't pretend that outcome felt like complete justice to Garrick, because it didn't. Ven's death closed the immediate danger without ever forcing him to answer publicly for a stolen life. 2 dead parents who'd grieved a son who wasn't actually dead, and 14 years of a woman he'd come to genuinely care for, carrying the weight of his secret largely alone. Merritt offered him, in the weeks following the coronation, considerable public honor, a full restoration of his true identity and record, formal recognition as the Dominion's most decorated living hero, resources and position enough to build any life he chose from this point forward. He accepted the restoration of his identity quietly, without the accompanying ceremony she initially proposed, and declined most of the rest, telling her, in a private conversation neither of them ever fully described to anyone else afterward, that he had no particular interest in becoming a symbol twice in one lifetime, that the only thing he genuinely wanted was for the true account of what happened to Ibset's falsified records, and Ven's 20-year cover-up to be added permanently to the Dominion's official history, so that no future guard who threw themselves into danger for this palace would ever again disappear so completely that even their own parents believed a lie about how they died. Merritt granted that request without hesitation, and arranged as well, something Garrick hadn't specifically asked for but received gratefully anyway. Formal permission and safe passage back to the small colony world where his parents were buried. A visit he made alone several weeks later, standing for a long time before 2 modest graves that had been tended. He learned from a distant relative he'd never previously known still lived nearby, faithfully for 14 years by people who genuinely believed they were honoring a dead son rather than waiting, unknowingly for one who might still impossibly come home. He didn't have any grand words for that visit. No closing speech that resolved 2 decades of stolen time into something clean or complete. He simply stood there, in the quiet of a modest colony cemetery, told his parents out loud everything he'd never been permitted to tell them while they were alive, understanding, with a grief that didn't fully close even now, that some debts simply couldn't be repaid no matter how thoroughly the truth eventually surfaced. He returned to Korest's Hollow rather than remaining in the Dominion capital, a choice that surprised Merritt's advisors considerably more than it surprised Merritt herself, who had come, across their brief renewed acquaintance, to understand something essential about the man who'd twice thrown himself into danger on her behalf, and asked for almost nothing in return. Corvine was waiting for him when he arrived, standing outside her tavern in the same perpetual twilight haze he'd once found so grim, and had come, across 2 stolen decades, to think of as something considerably closer to home than the golden light of that long-ago courtyard morning, and their reunion carried none of the dramatic weight the preceding weeks might have suggested it would. Simply 2 people who'd built something genuine across 14 years of careful, guarded friendship, finally able to build whatever came next without a stolen identity, standing permanently between them. Garrick Thane, restored now to his own true name after 20 years of living inside someone else's, went back to the refinery within a month, not because he needed the work any longer. Murit's gratitude had ensured he'd never need to work again if he chose not to, but because the ordinary, unglamorous rhythm of that labor had become, across 2 stolen decades, something closer to genuine peace than any grand recognition the Dominion capital could offer him. His fellow refinery workers, most of whom had known him for years under his false name, took the revelation of his true identity with a mixture of shock and, eventually, a kind of quiet, considerable respect that changed remarkably little about their daily working relationship. A fact Garrick found he appreciated more than he'd expected to. The specific comfort of continuing to be treated as a colleague rather than a legend by people who'd already known him, in every way that actually mattered. Long before the truth became public, he found, standing in the refinery's familiar noise and heat for the first time under his own real name, that some parts of the quiet life Ven's cruelty had forced him into were worth keeping. Freely chosen now on his own terms, rather than surviving inside a cage that had finally, 20 years too late, been permanently unlocked. He and Corvine married the following spring, a small, quiet ceremony attended by a handful of Korast's hollow neighbors and, at Garrick's own insistence, no representatives from the Dominion capital at all. A deliberate choice that Marette herself understood and respected, without needing any explanation. He wrote to her occasionally in the years that followed, brief, unassuming letters that described the ordinary rhythms of a life he'd finally built entirely on his own terms. And she wrote back less occasionally, letters that described a Dominion slowly, carefully rebuilding itself around a truth it could finally acknowledge, rather than the careful fiction Ven had once required it to maintain. And somewhere in that ongoing, unhurried correspondence between a sovereign and the guard who'd twice saved her life, both of them found something that felt, after everything, considerably more like closure than either had expected to ever actually receive.